Lost in the Folk Village, a true 1980s horror story. This happened to me in 1987, when I was 12 years old. Back then, South Korea was still finding its identity after decades of war and rebuilding. Traditional culture was something you experienced at places like folk villages, living museums where you could step back in time. What I experienced that October night wasn't just history coming alive. It was something much, much worse. Picture this. It's the late 80s. Back home in America, kids are watching the Goonies and playing with Rubik's Cubes. But I'm in Korea with my family, and we've just spent the day at Yongin Korean Folk Village. Think colonial Williamsburg, but with thatched roofs and rice paddies instead of tricorn hats and blacksmith shops. I was that kid. You know the one. 12 years old, thought I knew everything, and completely fed up with my parents' leisurely pace through the historical exhibits, while they're admiring some craftsmen making pottery, and my little siblings are asking a million questions. I'm thinking, this is boring. I'm gonna explore on my own. Worst decision ever. When day becomes night, here's the thing about folk villages. They're designed to feel authentic. During the day, that's charming. Actors in traditional Korean dress bow politely as you pass. The smell of wood smoke from cooking fires mingles with incense from small shrines. Everything feels safe and educational. But when the sun goes down, when the last tour bus pulls away and the staff goes home, that's when you realize these places were built to recreate life from centuries ago. And centuries ago, the night was full of things that would make your blood run cold. By the time I realized I was truly lost, the transition had already begun. One minute, there were families around me taking photos. The next, I was completely alone in a maze of traditional Korean houses, and the only light came from emergency fixtures spaced maybe 150 feet apart. Between those pools of sickly yellow light, pure darkness. The silence hit me first. You know that feeling when you're the last person in a building and you can actually hear the lights humming? It was like that, but worse. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if they knew something was wrong. Then came the dogs, the watchers on chains. Korean folk villages in the 80s weren't like the sanitized tourist attractions you see today. They had real guard dogs, massive German shepherds, and Korean jindos chained up around the property. During the day, these dogs just lay in the shade, barely acknowledging visitors. But at night, their eyes reflected that emergency lighting like burning coals, and they strained against heavy chains that looked like they belonged on a ship's anchor. The sound of those chains rattling in the darkness, it's something you never forget. I was tired. I'd been wandering around for what felt like hours, and I was starting to panic. My parents had probably realized I was missing by now. But what if they thought I'd gone back to the bus? What if they left without me? I found what looked like an empty storage room in one of the traditional houses and curled up in the corner. The smell hit me immediately. Old wood, musty fabric, and something else. Something organic and wrong, like fruit that had been left to rot in a basement. When I woke up, it was past midnight. The woman on the roof. My throat felt like sandpaper, and my stomach was cramping with hunger. But worse than the physical discomfort was this growing certainty that my parents had given up looking for me. You know how kids think, right? All those jokes about being adopted suddenly didn't seem so funny anymore. That's when I saw her. About 100 feet away, Silhouetted against the curved roofline of a traditional Korean house stood a woman in a hanbok. That's the traditional Korean dress, with the long flowing skirt. She was just standing there, perfectly still. The fabric of her dress moved in a breeze I couldn't feel. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cracking, like it did whenever I had to give presentations in school. "Can you tell me how to get out of here?" She turned toward me. I could see her do it even in the darkness, and pointed down the hill toward what looked like a street light. Relief washed over me like jumping into a swimming pool on a hot day. There it was, a three-way intersection with one of those metal information signs you see in parks. I bowed quickly. You always bow in Korea. It's just polite. And hurried toward the light. My sneakers made these weird echoing sounds on the packed earth path, like someone was following me, but trying to match my footsteps. When I looked back to wave thank you, the roofline was empty. Something in the bushes. The path down to that intersection ran between traditional houses on my right and this steep slope covered in thick brush on my left. Halfway down, maybe 75 feet from the light, something in that brush started moving. At first, it just sounded like a big dog or maybe a deer. You know, rustling through the undergrowth. But then I heard this breathing. Wet. Labored breathing with this weird whimpering sound underneath. Like someone trying not to cry, but failing. In the distance, all those guard dogs started going absolutely crazy. Now I was 12, right? And I grew up watching nature documentaries with my dad. My first thought was, oh no, there's an injured animal in there. So I did what any suburban American kid would do. I got curious. I crept toward the sound, and the brush kept shaking. That horrible breathing got louder. I picked up a couple of rocks, about the size of Altoids tins, and tossed one toward where I thought the animal might be. The rock landed closer than I expected, maybe 6 feet in front of me. Everything went quiet. Then, from down near the roots of the undergrowth, 2 human hands burst through the vegetation. But here's the thing. They weren't normal hands. The skin was this mottled dark color, like they'd been buried in dirt for weeks. The fingernails were too long, too dark, and they were clawing at the ground like someone trying to dig themselves out of their own grave. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed. Actually screamed, like a little kid in a haunted house. And then I started throwing rocks, every single rock I could find. Some of them hit with these wet, solid sounds that I still hear in nightmares sometimes. When I ran out of ammunition, those hands disappeared back into the brush. But I could still hear that awful breathing, getting fainter as whatever it was moved away from me. False hope. Under fluorescent light, the intersection was lit by one of those harsh fluorescent street lamps that make everything look like a crime scene photo. There was the metal information plaque I'd seen from the hill, but when I got close enough to read it, my heart sank. All it said was historical stuff about some nobleman who lived there 300 years ago. Nothing about exits, nothing about emergency procedures, nothing helpful at all. I had 3 choices. Go back the way I came, absolutely not happening. Take the left path toward where I could still hear those dogs barking. Or take the right path that disappeared into what looked like a residential area. I chose the dogs. At least their barking meant there was life somewhere in this place. The sleeping man. Following the sound of barking led me through a series of traditional Korean houses. These weren't just exhibits. They were complete recreations, with courtyards and gates, and all the details you'd find in a real Joseon dynasty home. To get through, I had to push open these heavy wooden gates that creaked like something out of a horror movie. I tried to open them just wide enough to slip through, but they always seemed to swing wider than I wanted, announcing my presence to whatever might be listening. In one courtyard, I pushed open a gate and immediately froze. Near the base of a stone wall, maybe 20 feet away, lay a man in traditional white Korean clothing. He was positioned with this perfect military precision. Arms at his sides, legs straight, face turned up toward the sky. The white fabrics seemed to glow in the moonlight, but his chest was rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to wake him up. There was something about the way he lay there, so perfectly still, so perfectly positioned. That made me think disturbing him would be the last mistake I ever made. I jumped over him, literally leaped over this sleeping man, and sprinted across the courtyard. The scavenger. The main courtyard beyond the sleeping man was maybe 40 feet across, with a traditional Korean house on one side and this open area in the middle. That's where I saw her. A woman in filthy traditional clothing was crouched in the dirt, scratching at the ground with her bare hands. She'd dig up something, dirt, roots, I couldn't tell what, and shove it in her mouth. Then she'd move to a different spot and do it again. Her movements were all wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by someone who'd never worked a puppet before. And she was muttering constantly, not Korean, not any language I recognized, but something that sounded ancient and wrong. When she turned in my direction, I caught a glimpse of her face in the moonlight. Her eyes were completely white. Not blind white, but filled with this milky substance that seemed to swirl and move like someone had poured cream into water. I dropped flat on my belly. An army crawled under the raised wooden platform of the house. Through gaps in the floorboards, I could see her feet shuffling past, hear her fingernails scraping against wood and stone as she searched for whatever she was eating. When she moved to the far end of the courtyard, I crawled out and ran for the main gate. The second my feet hit the path outside, her muttering stopped. What replaced it sounded like breaking glass. Or maybe laughter. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The guardian dog. The German shepherd that had been barking was enormous. Easily the biggest dog I'd ever seen, probably 90 or 100 pounds of pure muscle. Its eyes held this intelligence that was almost human, and when it saw me stumble out of the darkness, it didn't just bark. It roared. But here's the weird part. It wasn't looking at me. Its attention was fixed on something behind me, something that had followed me from that courtyard. Foam was dripping from its muzzle, and every muscle in its body was tense like it was about to attack. Without thinking, I dove into its doghouse. One of those red plastic barrels they'd cut a door into, probably meant for storing kimchi originally. The dog and I both barely fit, but I was too terrified to care. The shepherd kept up its furious barking, occasionally lunging toward the darkness as far as its chain would allow. In the brief quiet moments between barks, I could hear other sounds, footsteps from multiple directions, whispers in languages that sounded older than modern Korean. And underneath it all, this rhythmic scraping like bone against stone. The broom. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out of that doghouse, I spotted something leaning against a tree about 30 feet away. A traditional Korean broom made from bound twigs. Back then, every Korean grandmother had one for sweeping their courtyards. To me, it looked like salvation. A weapon, a tool. Something real and normal in a place that had become anything but. Getting to it meant moving that heavy plastic barrel like a turtle shell, inching forward while that massive dog stood guard against whatever was lurking behind me. The barrel probably weighed 40 or 50 pounds, but adrenaline is a hell of a thing. When I finally had that broom in my hands, I felt brave for the first time since dark fell. Armed with my makeshift weapon, I left the dog's protection and headed toward what looked like the main path out of the village. That was my second worst mistake of the night. The crossroads. Eventually, I reached this wider area, where 5 different paths came together, around what might have been a small pond. Under normal circumstances, it would have been beautiful. A traditional Korean garden, with this graceful wooden bridge arching over dark water. Now it felt like a trap. My options were A. Cross the bridge over water so dark it didn't reflect any light. B. Take a path toward a house where strips of white fabric fluttered in air so still I couldn't feel any breeze. C. Follow a narrow passage squeezed between high stone walls. D. Head toward distant light where I could make out what looked like a person, or E. Go back the way I came. The figure near the light seemed like my best bet. Maybe it was a night security guard. Maybe it was one of my parents searching for me. I gripped that broom tighter and started walking toward what I hoped was rescue. I was so wrong. The Shadow Man. As I got closer to the light, maybe 30 feet away, that figure became more distinct, but in all the wrong ways. It moved constantly, swaying back and forth, but it never seemed to have a fixed shape. It was like looking at smoke, or shadows cast by a fire I couldn't see. When I got within about 10 feet, I realized what I was actually looking at. A person-shaped hole in reality. A darkness so complete, it seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. It moved with purpose but had no substance, like someone had taken scissors and cut a human silhouette out of the world itself. I tried to walk around it, giving it plenty of space, but it shifted to block my path. When I held up my broom to push it aside, the shadow stopped moving entirely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound could have been. I turned and ran back toward the crossroads, my sneakers slapping against the packed earth path. Lights on the mountain. Behind me, that shadow thing stayed perfectly still, but all around the village new lights began appearing. They danced on the hillsides like will-o'-the-wisps, dozens of them moving in patterns that looked intelligent and purposeful. Years later, my parents told me these were search teams with flashlights, combing the mountains for their lost daughter. But in that moment, at 12 years old and scared out of my mind, they looked like something much older and more dangerous. I ran through those narrow alleys with tears streaming down my face, no longer caring about being quiet or careful. The lights seemed to track my movement, always just out of direct sight, always following. The watcher on the roof. As I fled through the maze of traditional buildings, something made me look up. On the curved tile roof of what looked like a nobleman's house, perfectly balanced about 20 feet above the ground, stood an elderly Korean man in traditional dress. He wore a gat, that tall black hat Korean noblemen used to wear, and his face was clearly visible in the moonlight. His eyes were like glass marbles, reflecting light with this unnatural brilliance. His beard was perfectly groomed, his posture regal and commanding. He looked exactly like the distinguished ancestors you see in old Korean family portraits. except for one crucial detail. He was watching me. As I ran past his house, his head turned to follow my movement with mechanical precision. His expression never changed, but those glassy eyes tracked me with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. When I reached the next intersection and looked back, he was gone. But when I looked ahead toward a grove of bamboo that marked my next landmark, there he was again, standing impossibly on the very tips of the bamboo stalks, his weight causing no disturbance to the delicate plants below. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with anything human. The wind chime symphony. The sound started soft and musical. The gentle tinkling of wind chimes, which were common decorations in traditional Korean homes. They were supposed to bring good fortune and ward off evil spirits. But there was no wind that night. The air was completely still. As I got closer to the source, maybe 50 feet away, I could see the chimes hanging from the eaves of a house. Delicate metal discs that caught moonlight as they moved. Above them, seated cross-legged on the wooden platform like some terrible conductor, was the same elderly man I'd seen on the rooftops. His hands were enormous, way too big for his body, maybe twice the size they should have been. He was striking the chimes with deliberate rhythm. Ting, 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 ting. Each note seemed to vibrate in my chest, creating a melody that was both beautiful and deeply, fundamentally wrong. He never looked directly at me, but I knew he was aware of my presence. Every strike of those chimes was perfectly timed to my heartbeat, as if he were conducting some cosmic orchestra, and my terror was the primary instrument. I dropped that broom and ran faster than I'd ever run in my whole life. The final sprint. Those last 300 feet to the village entrance felt like running through quicksand. My legs were heavy with exhaustion, my lungs burning with each breath. Behind me, I could hear those chimes getting fainter, but the lights on the mountainside seemed to be converging, drawing closer to the village. When I finally saw the bright fluorescent lights of the entrance gate, I burst into tears. Not the silent tears of fear I'd been crying, but loud, heaving sobs of relief and exhaustion. That's when a door burst open maybe 30 feet from the gate, and my mother came running out, screaming my name in a voice hoarse from hours and hours of searching. She grabbed me so tight I could barely breathe, and I could feel her whole body shaking. Whether from relief or leftover panic, I couldn't tell. She was crying and laughing at the same time, checking every inch of my body for injuries, while muttering prayers in Korean under her breath. She found the scratches on my knees from crawling under that house, the dog hair on my clothes, the dirt under my fingernails from throwing rocks at those horrible hands. Then the relief turned to fury. She was absolutely livid. I'd never seen my mum that angry before or since. The lecture that followed was in rapid-fire Korean, and I understood maybe half of what she was saying. But the message was crystal clear. I had scared her more than anything ever had in her entire life. It was almost 3 a.m. when we finally made it back to Seoul. As our car wound down the mountain road away from the folk village, I pressed my face to the rear window and watched those traditional rooftops disappear into the darkness. For just a moment, silhouetted against the sky on the highest roof, I thought I saw a tall figure in a black hat watching our car until we disappeared around a curve. That happened back in the 80s. And I can still remember every detail like it was yesterday. The smell of that musty storage room, the weight of that plastic doghouse on my shoulders, the sound of those wind chimes echoing through the darkness. I've lived in different countries since then, seen places that most people only read about in books. But nothing has ever compared to what I experienced that night at Yongin Folk Village. Here's what most people don't realize about Korean folk villages. They don't just recreate historical buildings. Many of them actually moved real houses, piece by piece, from their original locations. Houses where real families lived, loved, and died centuries ago. When you are walking through these villages, you're not just looking at replicas. You're stepping inside spaces where generations of people experienced their most intense emotions. Joy, sorrow, fear, and everything in between. Korean folklore is filled with different types of spirits. There are the hungry ghosts who died in famines, the vengeful spirits of those who died unjustly, and the restless souls who can't find peace. According to traditional beliefs, these spirits are drawn to familiar places, especially the homes where they once lived. So, when those historical buildings were moved to create the folk village, did something else move with them? Were those traditional houses still home to their original residents? I can't say for certain what I encountered that night, but I can tell you this. Whatever was in that village wasn't part of any historical reenactment. Have any of you had experiences in historical places that felt off? Places where the past seemed a little too present? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because after what happened to me back in the 80s, I've learned that some history refuses to stay buried. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's still watching from the rooftops, waiting for curious kids who wander too far from safety. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more real encounters with the unexplained. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.